Millionaire promised pretend, yet her breath made him burn all night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The night was heavy with rain, pounding against the tall glass windows of the penthouse like a relentless drum. Inside, the millionaire sat stiffly in a perfectly tailored suit, his jaw set, eyes dark with calculation. Across from him, she sat quietly, her fingers tightening around the thin folder of legal documents that carried the weight of her life. "This is only pretend," he said, his voice calm but cold, as though he were negotiating another billion-dollar deal rather than deciding the fate of two people. "You will sign this contract. You will be my wife in the eyes of the world. But you and I, we are nothing more than a business arrangement. Do you understand?" She lifted her eyes to him, meeting that piercing gaze. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. Her mother's medical bills, the looming eviction notice, the debts pressing on her shoulders, she had no choice. "I understand," she whispered, though her voice trembled like a fragile thread about to break. The pen felt heavier than iron in her hand as she signed her name. With that single motion, her life was bound to his. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper felt louder than the thunder rolling outside. When she slid the contract back across the table, his hand brushed hers for the briefest second. She froze. His skin was warm, steady, and strong. And yet, he pulled back instantly, as though burned, as though the promise of distance had to be maintained at all costs. "You will move into my home tomorrow," he instructed, his tone clipped, each word precise. "Appearances matter. The press will believe we are married. My family will believe it. Everyone will believe it. But you must never forget it. It is only pretend." Her lips curved in a faint smile, not out of joy but out of defiance. She had agreed to the contract, but deep inside, she wondered how long a man could chain himself to lies before the truth started breaking through. The next morning, she arrived at his mansion. The house was vast, far larger than any space she had ever set foot in. Chandeliers glistened overhead, marble stretched endlessly beneath her feet, and portraits of ancestors stared down at her as though she did not belong. A maid bowed slightly, leading her through hallways that smelled faintly of cedarwood and expensive cologne. In the grand dining room, he was already seated, flipping through financial reports while sipping his coffee. Not once did he look up. Not once did he acknowledge her presence beyond a single sentence. "You are late." Low. Her cheeks flushed, though she said nothing. She took her seat across from him, the silence between them sharp enough to cut. The clinking of silverware echoed like distant thunder. But as she raised her cup of tea, her hand trembled. He noticed. He always noticed. His eyes flicked up for a second, catching the slight shake, and for a brief moment his mask faltered. His gaze softened, barely perceptible, before hardening again as he forced his attention back to the papers in his hand. That night, in the silence of her new room, she leaned against the window, watching the city lights blur beneath the rain. She whispered to herself, "It is only pretend, just pretend." But deep in her chest, where her heart refused to obey contracts or conditions, a seed of something else began to stir. And across the hall, the millionaire lay in his room, staring at the ceiling, fists clenched. He had promised distance. He had promised control. Yet the memory of her trembling hand, the sound of her fragile voice, and the warmth of her skin would not leave him. For the first time in years, he realized he was losing the battle against himself. The next days unfolded like a silent play where every gesture carried weight but no words bridged the distance. She woke up in a wing of the mansion that felt less like a home and more like a museum, each room echoing with the absence of warmth. The maid spoke softly around her, respectful but distant, as though instructed to keep their boundaries. At breakfast, the millionaire was always there first. His black coffee sat untouched while he scrolled through his tablet, scanning reports, shifting between stock numbers and emails with the precision of a machine. She would sit across from him, her tea trembling faintly in her hands. They were married in name, bound by law, but the silence between them stretched like a canyon. One morning, she finally dared to speak. "Do you want more sugar in your coffee?" Her voice was gentle, almost fragile. He did not even look up. "I drink it black." His answer was curt, absolute. And then he turned another page on his screen. The conversation died before it even began. The chauffeur drove them together to charity galas, to family dinners, to events where flashing cameras followed their every step. In public, his hand rested on the small of her back, his voice softened into charm, his smile convincing enough to fool the world. But the moment the doors closed behind them, the distance returned. He would walk ahead, his shoulders rigid, while she trailed a few steps behind. She told herself not to care. She reminded herself every night, "It is only pretend." But each time she caught his reflection in the glass windows, tall, composed, and impossibly unreachable, her heart betrayed her. One evening, she entered the grand dining room to find the storm raging outside, lightning splitting the sky. He sat at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. It was the first time she had seen him undone. For a moment, she almost forgot to breathe. She took her seat quietly. When the maid served her plate, her hand brushed against the hot porcelain, and she flinched, spilling water across the tablecloth. The room fell still. She looked up, embarrassed, expecting sharp words, but instead, his chair scraped back. He reached for a napkin, his hand steady as he placed it over the spill. Their eyes met. It was only a few seconds, but something shifted. His gaze was softer, searching. He cleared his throat quickly, retreating back into his cold shell, saying only, "Be more careful." But the moment lingered in her chest like an ember refusing to die. Nights were the hardest. Her room was beautiful, with silk sheets and golden lamps, yet it felt unbearably empty. Across the hall, she knew he was awake too. She sometimes heard his footsteps pacing, the faint sound of glass as he poured himself another drink. They were two souls trapped in the same gilded cage, bound by a contract that demanded distance, while their hearts ached for something else. Days became weeks, their lives intertwined by routine, yet never truly touching. She began to notice small cracks in his mask. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. The way his jaw tightened when another man greeted her too warmly at an event. The way his hand always hovered near hers in crowded rooms, but never quite touched. And she began to wonder if everything was only pretend. Why did it feel so painfully real? The change began not with grand gestures, but with the smallest details that slipped through the cracks of their contract. One morning, she walked into the kitchen earlier than usual. To her surprise, he was already there, sleeves rolled up, pouring himself a glass of water. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the sink. She froze, unsure if she should leave, but then he spoke without looking at her. "Your tea," he said, his tone flat but not unkind. "You usually take it with honey, not sugar." Her eyes widened. She had never told him that. He had noticed, quietly, in the silence of their mornings together. It was a small thing, almost nothing, yet her chest tightened, as though the walls of the mansion had shifted ever so slightly. Another evening, she fell asleep on the sofa while reading. She woke hours later to find a blanket draped over her shoulders. The lights were dimmed, the fire had been tended, and she realized he must have been the one who had done it. He never mentioned it the next day, and she did not bring it up, but the warmth of that blanket lingered longer than the fire itself. The nights continued with their unspoken distance, but the air between them thickened with tension. At a charity gala, her heel snapped on the marble staircase. She nearly fell, but his arm was there instantly, steady and strong, pulling her back before disaster struck. The cameras flashed, capturing the perfect image of a protective husband and his wife. The world saw a fairy tale moment, but for her, it was something else. His hand gripped her waist longer than necessary, his breath close enough for her to feel. Later that night, she stood before her mirror, touching the place where his hand had been, her reflection trembling with questions she dared not say aloud. He was fighting it too. In his office, he stared at contracts and reports, but saw only her face. He had promised himself distance, had promised that she was nothing more than a signature on paper, but the memory of her soft voice, the way she looked up at him with quiet resilience, gnawed at him. His hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching, as though resisting the urge to reach for what he swore he did not want. One rainy afternoon, she caught him outside near the stables. The storm had passed, but the ground was muddy. A stray dog had wandered onto the property, shivering and wet. To her astonishment, the millionaire, always so composed and untouchable, knelt in the dirt and wrapped his coat around the animal. His hair was damp, his shoes ruined, but he carried the trembling creature in his arms, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She stood there, unable to move, watching the man behind the mask. He glanced up, startled to see her, and for once he had no words. Their eyes locked, and the silence between them was filled with something raw and undeniable. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe he is not as cold as he wants the world to believe." He, too, found himself restless. Alone in his room, he touched the pen she had used to sign the contract weeks ago. The memory of her shaking hand, the way she forced courage into her fragile voice, would not leave him. He poured himself a drink but set it down untouched. No amount of wealth, no number on a screen, could silence the sound of her laughter echoing faintly in his memory. Little by little, the boundaries they had built began to blur. A shared glance at breakfast. A hand that lingered too long when passing her a glass. A silence that was no longer empty, but charged with something unspoken. It was still a contract. It was still pretend. Yet both of them could feel that something real was growing in the spaces they could not control. The contract had been designed to protect them both, to keep emotions sealed away like a locked vault. But life had its way of testing walls, and soon the foundation of their agreement began to crack. It started with a dinner hosted by his family, a gathering filled with influential relatives and sharp-eyed business partners. She sat beside him at the long mahogany table, nerves twisting in her stomach as whispers floated across the room. Every glance felt like a test, every smile a mask. The conversation shifted to marriage, to loyalty, to the image of a perfect union. Then, without warning, his cousin smirked and asked, "Why do you never kiss your wife in public? Surely a man as devoted as you would not be afraid of a little affection." The room fell quiet. She felt the air thicken, her pulse racing as eyes pinned them both in place. The millionaire's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he would brush it off with his usual coldness. Instead, he turned to her, his hand rising to cup her cheek. His lips pressed against hers, firm and deliberate, in front of everyone. Her breath caught. The kiss was supposed to be a performance, another layer of the lie. Yet something about the way his mouth lingered against hers told a different story. When he pulled away, her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the entire table could hear it. After the dinner, she retreated to her room, her thoughts spinning. She touched her lips, still burning, still trembling. Why did it feel real? She whispered to herself. He stood alone in his study, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His hands were clenched at his sides, the taste of her still on his tongue. He had crossed a line he swore he never would. The contract had promised distance, but tonight he had betrayed his own words. The following week, the pressure only grew. They attended a charity auction, where flashing cameras followed their every move. As the bids climbed higher, an older businessman leaned too close to her, complimenting her beauty in a way that felt less than polite. Before she could respond, the millionaire's hand closed firmly around her waist. He pulled her closer, his voice low, his eyes dangerous as steel. "She is my wife." The cameras caught it all. The photo made headlines the next morning. The millionaire's fierce display of devotion. She read the article with shaking hands. It was supposed to be pretend, a performance, yet his grip on her waist had been too tight, too protective, too real. He tried to bury himself in work, drowning in meetings and contracts. But every time he looked up from the papers, he saw her, her quiet smile at breakfast, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, the softness of her laughter echoing in the hall. These were not things a man should notice if it was only pretend. One stormy night, she confronted him in the hallway. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with defiance. "You said this was just a contract. You said this was pretend. Then why do you look at me like that? Why do you kiss me like that?" His breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. For a long moment he said nothing, fighting the war raging inside him. Finally, he forced the words out, cold and sharp, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. "Because the world expects it." "Ludo." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling, her hands shaking at her sides. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to cling to the contract, to the safety of rules. But deep inside, she knew his lie was already unraveling. That night, as she lay awake, tears burning her eyes, she realized the truth. The contract was no longer protecting them. It was tearing them apart. He had always been a man of order, a man who built walls higher than the city skyline itself. For years, discipline had been his shield, distance his weapon, and power his sanctuary. But now, those walls were collapsing from the inside, shaken not by enemies in business, but by the woman who shared his last name on paper. Late at night, he sat alone in his study, the glow of the fireplace flickering against his face. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but it remained untouched on the desk. His hand trembled as he pressed his fingers against his temples. Her image haunted him, the way her lips had parted in shock after that kiss, the softness of her eyes when she thought he was not watching, the subtle curve of her smile when she tried to hide her nervousness. "This was supposed to be pretend," he whispered into the empty room, as if the silence could answer him. "Why can I not stop thinking about her?" Across the hall, she lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling. She could still feel the press of his lips, the weight of his gaze, the tremor in his voice when he had tried to deny the truth. Her chest ached with confusion. She had entered this marriage to survive, to pay debts, to protect her family. But the man she was supposed to hate, the man she was supposed to see as nothing more than a contract, was slowly dismantling the walls around her heart. Days blurred together, filled with moments he could not control. At breakfast, he caught himself watching her fingers stir honey into her tea. In the hallway, their shoulders brushed, and he felt heat shoot through his veins like lightning. In the car, on the way to yet another event, the silence was heavy, not with distance, but with unspoken words, each second vibrating with restrained desire. He fought it. He told himself she was only a signature on a contract. He told himself the danger of caring was too great, that love was weakness, that emotions had no place in his world. Yet every night, when the mansion grew quiet, his body betrayed him. He could hear the faint sound of her laughter echoing in his memory, could smell the trace of her perfume lingering in the halls. One evening, he found her in the garden, sitting alone under the lantern lights. She looked small against the vastness of the estate, her arms wrapped around herself. He stepped closer without thinking, then stopped, his chest tightening. "You should not be out in the cold," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her eyes shimmering. "Why do you care?" The words hit him harder than any business rival ever could. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wanted to say everything, how he could not stop watching her, how every promise of distance had crumbled, how the thought of losing her terrified him. But instead, he forced the mask back on and turned away. Inside his room, he stood before the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink. His reflection stared back, hard and merciless, but his hands were shaking. He had promised distance. He had promised control. Yet his own body, his own heart, had betrayed him. She, too, was battling the same storm. In her journal, she wrote words she dared not say aloud. "If this is pretend, why does it hurt so much? If this is pretend, why does it feel like he sees me in ways no one else ever has?" The mansion became a battlefield of glances, of silences, of touches that lingered too long. Each step closer, they came to breaking the contract, the harder they tried to deny what was inevitable. He was a millionaire who promised pretend. She was a woman who promised herself not to fall. And yet, both of them were already drowning in the truth neither could admit. The fragile balance they had been fighting to maintain shattered the moment the outside world forced its way in. It began with whispers, the kind that slithered through boardrooms and charity events. Rumors that their marriage was too sudden, too polished, too perfect to be real. At first, the millionaire ignored them. He had dealt with gossip before, and power had always been enough to silence it. But this time, the whispers did not fade. They grew louder, sharper, until one morning a headline screamed from every newsstand, "The millionaire's marriage exposed, a contract or a love story." The article was cruel. It claimed their union was nothing more than a business transaction, a staged performance to protect his image. Worse, it painted her as a gold digger who had traded dignity for wealth. Paparazzi camped outside the mansion gates, their cameras flashing like lightning each time she stepped outside. Strangers hurled insults on the street, their words cutting deeper than any blade. She tried to stay strong, to remind herself it was only pretend, that this humiliation was part of the bargain. But at night, when she sat alone in her room, tears spilled silently down her cheeks. The contract had promised her protection, but now it felt like a weapon turned against her. He watched it all unfold, fury burning beneath his calm exterior. In board meetings, his competitors smirked, questioning his judgment. At family gatherings, sharp remarks cut into him, disguised as concern. His world of power and control was crumbling, not because of a business rival, but because of the lie he had built with her. One evening, as the storm outside raged, she confronted him in the study. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she held up a tabloid covered with their faces. "Do you see this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "They call me a liar. They call me a fraud. They call me your mistake. This contract was supposed to protect me, but it is destroying me." His chest tightened, the words lodging like knives. He wanted to tell her that she was not a mistake, that she was the only truth he had left in his world of lies. But pride chained his tongue. Instead, he muttered, "The scandal will pass. Stay quiet. Do not give them more to use against us." Her tears fell harder. "You still do not see it, do you? You may survive scandals, but I am the one being torn apart. I am the one paying the price for a lie I never asked for." She turned and fled the room, leaving him standing in the shadows, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. That night, another blow struck. A leaked document surfaced, online copies of their contract, proof of the marriage arrangement. The world now had evidence. The scandal exploded. Every headline more vicious than the last. The woman he had sworn to protect, even if only in pretend, was now being dragged through the mud because of him. He stood before the mirror, rage and guilt twisting inside him. His reflection was no longer the untouchable millionaire. It was a man who had failed. He remembered her words, "This contract is destroying me." For the first time, he realized she was right. The very paper that bound them together was the same paper tearing them apart. And deep inside, he knew he could no longer hide behind distance, no longer cling to the lie of pretend. Because if he stayed silent any longer, he would lose her completely. The storm of scandal reached its peak when they were forced to attend a press conference. The media had been relentless, demanding answers, circling the mansion like vultures. She stood beside him on the stage, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale under the harsh camera lights. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her, and for the first time, she wondered if she could survive this. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Reporters shouted questions, their voices sharp and unforgiving. Was your marriage a contract? Did she marry you for money? Is she just another woman you used to protect your empire? She lowered her gaze, unable to meet their eyes. The words cut too deep. She had not asked for this spotlight, this cruelty. The contract had been his idea, his world, his control. But now, she was the one standing in ruins. He stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to remain silent, to keep the mask of power and indifference. But then he saw her, her trembling shoulders, the tears she fought to hold back, the pain she carried because of him. In that instant, something inside him broke. He stepped forward, his voice steady but raw. Yes, the marriage began as a contract. The room exploded with chaos, cameras flashing wildly, reporters leaning forward with hungry eyes. He raised a hand, demanding silence. But what you do not understand is this: somewhere along the way, that contract stopped mattering. She stopped being a signature on paper. She became the woman I cannot live without. Gasps rippled through the room. She turned her head sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. He looked directly at her now, his voice louder, clearer. I was a coward. I hid behind rules, behind distance, behind lies. I told myself it was pretend, but every moment with her burned through the walls I built. I love her. I love her more than I have ever loved anything in this life. 2-4. The silence that followed was deafening. For once, the cameras seemed to pause. The reporters stunned into stillness. Her breath caught in her chest, her body trembling as his words washed over her. He had stripped himself bare, not as a millionaire, not as a man of power, but simply as a man who had fallen helplessly, irrevocably in love. In that moment, under the blinding lights of the world, the contract that had once chained them dissolved into nothing. The press conference ended in chaos, but his words echoed louder than any headline. That night, back at the mansion, the silence between them was no longer empty. She stood by the window, the city lights flickering below, her heart still reeling from what he had confessed in front of the entire world. He entered quietly, his steps hesitant for the first time since she had known him. In his hands, he carried the contract, the same papers that had bound them together in cold ink and cruel conditions. Without a word, he placed it on the table between them. Then, slowly, he tore it apart. The sound of ripping paper filled the room, each shred falling like pieces of the walls he had built around himself. "No more signatures, no more lies," he said, his voice unsteady but fierce. "I do not want a wife bound by a contract. I want you, only you, for as long as you will let me." "Buddy mate." Her breath caught. She had dreamed of hearing those words, but never believed he would truly say them. She stepped closer, her hand brushing against the torn papers. "And if the world still doubts us? If they still call me a fraud?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver necklace she had once lost during the chaos of an event. He had kept it, hidden away all this time. Now, he placed it gently into her palm. "Let them doubt, let them shout, none of it matters. What matters is that every day, from this moment on, I will prove to you that I choose you. Not for a headline, not for an image, but because I cannot imagine a life without you in it." Her tears spilled freely, not of pain this time, but of release. She pressed the necklace to her chest, overwhelmed by the man standing before her. Not the cold millionaire, not the ruthless businessman, but the man who had finally laid himself bare. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as it lifted to her cheek. "From this day forward, there is no contract, no pretend. There is only us." And for the first time since their marriage began, she leaned into his touch, not as a duty, not as an obligation, but as a choice. The torn contract lay scattered on the table, forgotten. In its place was something stronger than any legal document, his promise, his actions, his love, etched not in ink but in the truth of his heart. The world had not gone silent after his confession. If anything, the noise grew louder. Headlines screamed about the torn contract, business rivals gloated, and society critics sharpened their knives. But this time, the storm did not break her. And for the first time, he did not let her face it alone. When reporters jeered outside the gates, he stood by her side, his arm firm around her shoulders, his voice steady as he told them, "Say what you will about me, but you will not disrespect my wife." The world had expected him to retreat, to protect his empire with cold indifference. Instead, he protected her, not with money or contracts, but with action. The rivals who spread the rumors soon faced consequences. One by one, their schemes unraveled. A company that had mocked his so-called weakness was exposed in fraud. A family member who had sneered at her was caught in scandal. Justice came, not by his hand, but by the truth revealing itself. And as the vultures fell silent, the whispers turned into respect. People began to see her, not as a fraud, but as the woman who had stood tall, even when the world tried to break her. She no longer hid behind lowered eyes. She walked proudly beside him, her chin lifted, her hand in his. For the first time, she was not pretending to be his wife, she was living it. One evening, as the sun set over the city skyline, he led her into the garden where lanterns glowed softly in the dusk. In his hand, he held a ring, not the cold band from their contract, but a new one, chosen not out of obligation, but out of devotion. He knelt before her, his voice thick with emotion. "We began with lies, we began with a contract. But today, I ask you to stay with me in truth, not as my pretend wife, not as a shield against the world, but as the woman I will love, protect, and honor for the rest of my life." Her tears sparkled in the fading light as she whispered, "Yes." The garden seemed to exhale with them, the lanterns swaying gently as though blessing their vow. From that day forward, they were no longer bound by paper. Their bond was carved into their lives by trials, by fire, and by choice. The millionaire who once promised pretend had finally surrendered to what was real, and the woman who once signed her name in desperation now stood as his equal, his partner, his forever. Their story did not end with a contract. It began with a promise, one forged in love, tested by truth, and sealed in eternity.